A stage, a murder, and a killer who plays himself. Can Holmes untangle this twisted script? Welcome to Sherlock Mystery. I am your host, Thornby. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Hearing from you all makes this journey even more special. Let's begin. It was on a particularly dreary November afternoon that I returned to 221B Baker Street to find Sherlock Holmes in one of his rare states of contemplative inertia. Neither pacing nor playing the violin, but staring with unnerving intensity into the fire, his long, pale fingers steepled beneath his chin. The dense fog that clung to London that day crept even into the corners of the flat, dimming the light and muting the world to a murmur. "You've the look of a man awaiting a telegram, Holmes," I said as I removed my gloves. "A telegram, a letter, a knock upon the door, it matters not." "The drama is due to begin shortly, Watson," he replied, eyes still locked upon the hearth as though it were a stage curtain about to rise. Before I could inquire further, Mrs. Hudson entered with a calling card upon a tray. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes." "A Mr. Lionel Asprey." Holmes took the card without looking at it. "Ah, the stage manager arrives on cue." The name was vaguely familiar to me. Asprey. Of course. Lionel Asprey was a celebrated actor-manager of the Imperial Theatre, known for his commanding performances in melodramas and Shakespearean revivals. I had seen him once in a particularly stirring production of Macbeth and recalled how he had dominated the stage with a presence that could quiet even the rowdiest gallery. Moments later, the man himself was ushered in. He cut a dramatic figure in a dark frock coat and a heavy wool scarf, which he unwound with a trembling hand. His usually expressive face, painted so often with regal fury or comic delight, was today drawn, pale, and haunted. "Mr. Holmes." "Doctor," he said, nodding quickly to us both. "Forgive the intrusion, but I am at my wit's end." Holmes gestured to the chair across from him, his expression unreadable. "You come not in search of applause, Mr. Asprey. What has happened?" Asprey sat heavily, as though the fog outside had settled into his bones. "It's Richard Trevelyan, my colleague, my friend. He's dead. Found this morning in his dressing room at the Imperial. Throat cut, a tragic accident they're calling it. Or worse, a suicide." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And you disagree?" Asprey gave a short, humorless laugh. "Mr. Holmes, we are actors. Our lives are constructed of artifice and illusion, but even on the stage, Trevelyan could never convincingly play a man willing to take his own life. Someone killed him. But here is where it becomes strange." He reached into his coat and produced a folded playbill, yellowed and slightly crumpled. Holmes took it and scanned the contents. "The Mask of the Dagger," Holmes read, aloud. "A new melodrama in 3 acts, written by Richard Trevelyan, starring Richard Trevelyan and Lionel Asprey." "Yes," Asprey said, voice low. "Trevelyan penned the play himself, and in the final scene, his character is murdered by mine, in precisely the manner he was found this morning." There was a long silence. Holmes looked up from the program. "You're telling me your friend was killed in the exact fashion as written in the play?" "Precisely. In fact, the scene had only been rehearsed for the first time yesterday afternoon. Last night, Trevelyan stayed behind to revise his lines. This morning, he was discovered on the floor of his dressing room, exactly where his character dies in Act 3. "And who discovered the body?" Holmes asked. Asprey hesitated. "It was Doris Bramble, the stagehand. She found him when she arrived to prepare for a matinee that, of course, never happened." Watson leaned forward. "Surely Scotland Yard is involved." "They are. Inspector Gregson, I believe. But he's treating it as either suicide or an unfortunate rehearsal mishap. I told him the resemblance to the play was too coincidental. He dismissed it as theatrical fancy." That's when I came here." Holmes stood abruptly and began pacing the room, his coattails trailing like the curtain ropes of a backstage fly tower. A murder staged as theatre, a fiction brought to life. Delicious. "Tell me, Mr. Asprey, was there anyone who knew the contents of the play besides Trevelyan and yourself?" Asprey nodded. "The director, Frances Dalrymple, our lead actress, Margot Fenwick. A few others, stagehands perhaps. But Trevelyan kept it very close. He considered it his masterpiece." Holmes stopped pacing and stared hard at the man. "And who would benefit most from Trevelyan's death?" Asprey blinked. I don't know. He wasn't wealthy, nor was he particularly loved." "Then perhaps," Holmes murmured, eyes now glittering, "he was feared." He turned to me. "Watson, fetch your coat. We're going to the Imperial Theatre." Curtains up. And with that, he was gone, already halfway down the stairs before I'd even reached the hook where my hat still hung. The hansom cab rattled through the grey streets of London as Holmes leaned forward, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his deer stalker. I had seen that look before, the glint of intellect whetted by a puzzle no ordinary mind would touch. The fog thickened the air, lending an almost spectral quality to the gas lamps as we turned onto Haymarket and drew up before the ornate facade of the Imperial Theatre. A constable stood outside, his posture rigid but uneasy. He stepped aside wordlessly at Holmes's nod, apparently having been warned of our arrival. We were met in the vestibule by a man with sunken cheeks and the long, frayed scarf of a theatrical type. His gait was stiff, but not from age. I saw at once that it was from something else, pressure, perhaps guilt. "Frances Dalrymple," he introduced himself in a hushed tone, extending a gloved hand to Holmes. "I direct the productions here. You've come to examine Richard's room?" "Yes," Holmes said simply. "And everything else." Dalrymple looked briefly confused but ushered us in, leading us past shadowed velvet curtains and through a series of narrow corridors that smelled of paint, dust, and old wood polish. The theatre, emptied of audience and sound, felt oddly funereal, its grand pretensions now reduced to echoes and gloom. "It was through here," Dalrymple said, pausing outside a door with a cracked enamel sign. "Trevelyan, lead." A faint outline of dried blood marred the floorboards just outside it. Holmes did not hesitate. He entered the dressing room without a word, his eyes sweeping the cramped space. Painted mirrors, theatrical costumes hanging limp on hooks, and on the floor beside the dressing table, a faint outline of where the body had lain. He circled slowly, not touching anything but absorbing it all. "There," Dalrymple said quietly, pointing toward a blood-spattered chair. "He was found sitting upright, a dagger in the neck, the same one used in the final act of the play. We had a prop, of course, a retractable blade, but this wasn't it." Holmes knelt beside the blood stain, examining a single boot scuff on the floor just inside the door. "This dagger," he said without looking up, "was it ordinarily kept with the stage props?" Dalrymple nodded. "In the locked prop chest backstage." "And the key?" "Only Doris and I have one." Holmes stood abruptly. "And where is the prop chest now?" "In the wings. It hasn't been touched since yesterday. I shall want to examine it." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, note the footprint beside the threshold. The angle is odd. Whoever stood there was either in great haste or trying not to be seen. And see here. Residue on the doorknob. Grease paint, perhaps, or something used to mask fingerprints. Our killer was cautious but theatrical." Dalrymple swallowed. "Do you think it was someone in the company?" Holmes gave no answer. Instead, he gestured for us to proceed. We descended into the underbelly of the theatre, where ropes, sandbags, and stage machinery loomed like forgotten architecture. The prop chest, when opened by Doris Bramble, a wiry, no-nonsense woman with grease on her hands and eyes that missed nothing, contained an array of theatrical weapons, all clearly props. except for one slot that was conspicuously empty. "The retractable dagger went missing last night," she said. "I thought Richard had it, revising his scene and all." Holmes nodded. "And you were the one to find him?" She hesitated. "Yes, around 10 this morning. I knocked, no answer. Door wasn't locked. When I saw the blood, I screamed." Holmes studied her. "And you locked up after that?" "Dalrymple did. Police took over soon after." Holmes said nothing further, but I could tell his thoughts were active. He wandered to the prop chest, inspecting its lock, the hinges, and even the interior lining. Then he asked to see the rehearsal schedule. Dalrymple fetched it, and Holmes studied it intently. Trevelyan revised Scene 4 alone. Scene 3, his confrontation with Asprey, was rehearsed with the full cast. This means anyone present then knew the blocking of the murder scene, and only one person would understand how to stage such a killing so convincingly, someone who understood both drama and blood. "You mean the killer made it look like a scene from the play, to blur the line?" I said. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "A murder disguised as performance. Clever, Watson, most clever. But every performance has a rehearsal, and every actor leaves traces." He turned sharply. "I wish to speak with Miss Fenwick." Margot Fenwick, when summoned, entered with a mixture of reluctance and veiled confidence. She was striking, tall, red-haired, with a dancer's posture and an actress's poise. Her eyes, though mournful, glimmered with something I could not quite name. "I still cannot believe it," she said softly. "Richard was difficult, yes, but he was brilliant. That someone would do this—" "Miss Fenwick," Holmes interrupted gently, "tell me of the last rehearsal." She hesitated. "It went well. There was tension between Richard and Lionel, but that was usual. They clashed creatively, but it never escalated." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And off stage?" She gave a slight shrug. "Richard had enemies, if that's what you mean. Frances resented how much control Richard wanted over the production, and Doris hated how he belittled her stagecraft. Even I wasn't immune to his moods. But murder? Did he say anything odd yesterday?" "Yes," she replied after a pause. "He said he was going to rewrite the ending, said the truth deserved a final curtain no audience expected. I assumed it was a metaphor. Perhaps it wasn't." Holmes's gaze lingered on her a moment longer. "Thank you, Miss Fenwick. You've been helpful." As she left, Holmes turned to me with a curious expression. "Watson, I believe our playwright was planning a reveal of his own. A secret he meant to bring to the stage. Something that threatened someone enough to silence him. You believe the motive lies not in the act, but the script. I believe," he said, "that Trevelyan may have written his own death not as tragedy, but as blackmail." He turned to Dalrymple. "I want access to the original script, the annotated one." Unedited Dalrymple hesitated. "It's in his office. Locked." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then I trust you'll unlock it, before our killer strikes their second cue." And so the play continued, no longer confined to the stage, but written in ink, blood, and the silence, between lines unspoken. Dalrymple led us up a narrow, creaking staircase to a small office above the stage. The air grew colder as we climbed, the smell of grease paint and old paper mixing with the musty scent of forgotten scripts. At the top, he paused before a solid oak door, his keys jangling with what I suspected was more nervousness than dexterity. The door creaked open to reveal a cramped office lined with bookshelves, mostly volumes of plays, prompt scripts, and old ledgers. A cluttered desk stood beneath the only window, its surface buried under paperweights, quill pens, and stacks of marked-up pages. A half-empty bottle of brandy sat beside an ashtray smudged with cigar ash. Holmes stepped inside and drew the curtains fully open, letting in the pallid London light. "There," Dalrymple said, gesturing to a worn leather folio lying on the desk. "That's the original draft of The Mask of the Dagger. Trevelyan worked on it here most nights. Holmes reached for the folio with gloved hands, flipping it open carefully. I moved to stand beside him and peered over his shoulder as he began turning the pages. Trevelyan's script was written in a sharp, angular hand, each line of dialogue annotated in red ink with cues, motivations, and performance notes. He read several pages in silence, eyes narrowing slightly. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "Note the changes in the margins. Look here, Watson. The third act has been revised. The stage direction in the murder scene now reads, 'The dagger is drawn not by the villain, but by the victim himself, though the audience does not know until the final moment.' Yet in performance, it was always the villain who delivered the fatal blow." Dalrymple seemed taken aback. "That's impossible. We rehearsed it with Asprey, killing Trevelyan's character. This annotation, it must be recent." Holmes nodded slowly, which suggests Trevelyan was crafting a last-minute twist, one that alters the audience's understanding after the curtain falls. He was planning to reveal that his character orchestrated his own death as a kind of moral play, perhaps to punish those around him. He flipped another page, then stopped. "Ah, what is it?" I asked. Holmes pointed to a section of notes scrawled in a different hand. "This page here, these aren't Trevelyan's annotations. Different ink, different slant. Someone else has made alterations. Note this passage. His sins are echoed in each character. He has played them all for fools." That's not stage direction. That's accusation. Dalrymple frowned. "Are you suggesting someone tampered with the script after his death?" "I'm suggesting someone tampered with it before his death. Someone who knew what Trevelyan was planning and intended to redirect suspicion elsewhere." At that moment, we heard rapid footsteps on the stairs. Doris Bramble appeared, breathless and wide-eyed. "Mr. Holmes, there's been another incident. Miss Fenwick's dressing room. Someone's broken in." Holmes and I followed her quickly, Dalrymple trailing in stunned silence. We descended again into the theater's depths, then through the maze of hallways behind the stage to the actress's room. The door hung open on bent hinges, and the contents of her vanity had been swept to the floor, powder, papers, and cracked rouge compacts scattered everywhere. Holmes moved through the wreckage with precision, scanning each surface. Then he reached down and lifted a torn envelope from beneath the desk. "No address," he said quietly, inspecting the jagged tear. "And no letter inside. But this," he added, sniffing lightly, "carries the scent of pipe tobacco. Not Miss Fenwick's brand, I presume." Doris shook her head. "She doesn't smoke." Holmes turned to Dalrymple. "Who among the cast or crew smokes a Balkan blend? Heavier, richer than your usual fare?" Dalrymple looked uncertain. "Asprey does, I think. Always has. Says it keeps him in his voice." Holmes pocketed the envelope. "Then I shall wish to speak with Mr. Asprey again. Immediately." We found him in the green room, seated in a brooding slump, a fresh cigar resting in an ashtray at his elbow. He stood as we entered, but his expression did not brighten. "You've heard, then?" he asked. "About Margot's dressing room?" "We have," Holmes replied. "And I must ask you, did you place any notes in Trevelyan's copy of the script?" Asprey frowned. "What sort of notes?" "Anything that might be seen as criticism. Personal remarks. Something not meant for the rest of the cast. Number, I mean, we all scribbled things during rehearsal. Blocking, lines to cut. But personal notes. Number, have you ever used this?" Holmes withdrew the torn envelope and held it up. "Unmarked stationery. Slightly scented." Asprey shrugged. "Possibly. I send notes to cast members, yes. Is that a crime now?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he turned to me and said, "Watson, do you recall the line Miss Fenwick quoted from Trevelyan? 'The truth deserves a final curtain no audience expects.'" "I do." "Well," Holmes said, "I believe we've just drawn it back a few inches." He turned to Asprey once more. "If you were to hide a letter, One you regretted sending. Where would you place it in a theatre filled with props and costume changes? Asprey looked at him as though uncertain whether to answer seriously. Anywhere. A false book on the set. A coat pocket in the wardrobe, behind a panel. Holmes gave a tight nod. Then I suggest we begin in the wardrobe. We crossed quickly to the costume room, a long, narrow chamber with racks of garments from countless eras. Frock coats, petticoats, breastplates, and togas. Holmes moved among them like a man gliding through a library, brushing aside fabrics until he reached a shelf of hats. "Help me, Watson," he said. "Lift the center shelf." It took a moment, but together we raised the false top, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Inside lay a single folded page. Holmes unfolded it and read silently, his brow furrowing. Then he handed it to me. The letter was addressed to R and read, "You cannot go through with it, not after what you did to Eleanor. If the truth comes out, it will ruin more than just you. I've protected you long enough. I'm done. If you force my hand, I swear I'll make sure the curtain comes down, for both of us." It was unsigned. I looked at Holmes. "Who's Eleanor?" Holmes folded the page again and pocketed it. "That, Watson, is our next question. And I suspect the answer lies not in the theatre, but in the past Trevelyan wished to rewrite." He turned, his expression sharpening. "We must find Miss Fenwick again, and we must learn who Eleanor was, before our killer writes their encore." We found Miss Fenwick in the shadowed solitude of the stage, seated alone in the front row of the empty stalls, gazing up at the footlights as if seeking answers among the silent curtains. She started slightly at our approach, but her poise returned almost immediately. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "I've no desire to be frightened, but the intrusion into my room was not random," Holmes finished for her. "And you're not easily frightened, Miss Fenwick. You're far too accustomed to masks." Her expression flickered. "Masks are a necessity in the theatre." "And off it too, it seems," Holmes replied. He took the seat beside her, folding his hands in his lap. "I need to ask you about a woman named Eleanor." There was the faintest tightening at the corners of her eyes. She looked away toward the footlights. "You know, then, I know that someone wrote a letter to Richard Trevelyan, warning him not to go through with it. I know that the letter referenced a past act involving Eleanor, something damaging enough that someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. What I do not yet know is who Eleanor was, or what she meant to all of you." Miss Fenwick remained quiet for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Then she exhaled. "Eleanor Blake," she said. "She was an actress, briefly, a minor role in one of Trevelyan's earlier productions. This would have been 2 years ago, The Merchant's Mirror. She was young, talented, but unsure of herself. I tried to help her, but Richard took an interest. The wrong kind." She paused. "There was a scandal. Whispered, never proven. She vanished from the company within weeks. Some say she was paid to leave. Others say she harmed herself." "Did she?" Holmes asked. "I don't know," Fenwick said with honest weariness. "No one heard from her again." Holmes stood. "And who knew of this?" "Dalrymple, Doris, and Lionel. They were all there. The entire company was. But only a few saw it, clearly. I remember Lionel arguing with Richard about it, saying it would ruin them all. Dalrymple pretended not to see. Doris didn't speak of it, but she knew." Holmes nodded once, briskly. "And now, 2 years later, Trevelyan writes a play with a murder mirroring his own, inserts changes that reflect guilt, and prepares to alter the ending just before his death. If this was an attempt at a public confession disguised as theatre, someone ensured he'd never deliver it." Miss Fenwick's voice dropped. "You think it was Lionel?" "I think the question is no longer who could have killed Trevelyan, but who had the most to lose if the truth about Eleanor came to light." He turned to me. "Watson, we must speak to Doris Bramble again. There's something she saw or knows that hasn't yet come to light. and I believe she may have been the original recipient of that torn letter. We found Doris by the stage rigging, tightening a counterweight rope with practiced efficiency. She looked up as we approached, her expression guarded. "I told you everything I saw," she said quickly, eyes flicking between us. "No," Holmes replied gently. "You told me what was safe to say." Doris's jaw tensed. "You knew Eleanor Blake, didn't you?" Holmes pressed. "Yes," she muttered. "Everyone did." "You saw what happened to her." "I saw enough." "Then you knew what Trevelyan's play meant, what the ending he planned to stage would reveal." She swallowed. I thought it was madness, that he'd bring it up after all this time, but he was obsessed, said it was the only way he could sleep. He wanted to punish us, all of us, even himself. "Is that why you broke into Fenwick's dressing room, to retrieve the letter you wrote him?" She froze. "I didn't." Holmes produced the envelope. "You wrote to him in desperation. You warned him not to do it, to keep Eleanor's story buried. The letter was taken, perhaps by the real killer, but your scent is still in the room." The fear Doris looked away, her voice cracking. "I never meant for anyone to die. I just wanted it to stop." Holmes nodded gravely. "Then help me make sure it does." She hesitated, then spoke. "He rehearsed the new ending the night before he died. Alone. But I saw someone else come in, after rehearsal had ended. I was in the fly loft, running maintenance. I saw Lionel enter Trevelyan's dressing room. They argued. I didn't hear the words, but it was heated. You didn't report it. Would they have believed me?" She snapped, then dropped her gaze. "Number, I've kept too many secrets already." Holmes said nothing, but I could tell his mind was working swiftly, connections crystallizing behind his gaze. He turned sharply. "We must speak to Asprey again. Now." Asprey, when confronted in the theater manager's office, was visibly rattled. He stood too quickly, knocking over his script binder. "You've spoken to Doris, then?" he said, attempting a smile that failed entirely. Holmes did not return it. "You visited Trevelyan's room the night he died?" Asprey gave a dismissive laugh. "I visited often. We were partners." Holmes stepped closer. "You argued. About Eleanor. About what he planned to reveal. He threatened to make your guilt public. Perhaps not directly, but through his play. A confession by art. And you couldn't risk it." "I didn't kill him," Asprey snapped. "Yes, we argued. Yes, I begged him to reconsider. He ruined Eleanor. I covered it up. I thought it was the only way to protect the theater, to protect all of us, but I didn't murder him." Holmes studied him. "Then who did?" Asprey hesitated. "I left him alive. That I swear." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Did you lock the door?" "Number, it was never locked." Holmes turned to me, his voice suddenly urgent. "Watson, we must find Dalrymple." "Dalrymple?" Holmes nodded grimly. "He had access, motive, opportunity. He hid in plain sight, shaping the production's every beat. If Asprey left the room unlocked, Dalrymple could have slipped in, unseen. We found Dalrymple not in his office, but on stage, seated in the director's chair, staring up at the fly rigging. When he saw us, he didn't rise. "I suppose you've come for the final act," he said softly. Holmes stepped forward. "It was you." Dalrymple nodded once. "He was going to destroy everything, the company, the reputation, Eleanor's memory. I couldn't let that happen." "You staged it all," Holmes murmured. "Even the dagger. You knew the scene, you knew the cues, and you knew no one would question the reality of what looked like performance." Dalrymple's voice was hollow. "In the end, he wrote his own death. I merely edited the final line." Holmes said nothing. He let the silence settle like a closing curtain. Then he turned to me. "Come, Watson. I believe our business here is concluded." And as we stepped out into the fog once more, the theater behind us faded into shadow, its secret spent, its tragedy complete. The gas lamps outside the Imperial Theatre burned low as we emerged into the thick London fog, and yet Holmes made no move toward a cab. He stood motionless on the pavement, hands clasped behind his back, eyes turned not to the street but inward, to the shifting pattern of thought that I had seen precede many of his most brilliant deductions. "Watson," he said slowly. Dalrymple's confession was too neat, too resolved. A final curtain call delivered with theatrical precision, as though written for applause. "You don't believe him?" I asked. "I believe he killed Richard Trevelyan," Holmes replied. "But I do not believe he acted alone." I followed his gaze back toward the theatre's facade. The fog wreathed its ornamental pillars like stage smoke, casting the building in a ghostly pallor. "Consider the sequence of events," Holmes continued. "Trevelyan rewrites the play to implicate himself in a fictional guilt. A device, certainly, but also a warning. He intended the play as a mirror held up to those who had betrayed Eleanor Blake. He knew his life might be endangered by such an exposure. And so he made the play a trap." "For Dalrymple?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Dalrymple was a director, not a killer by instinct. He had loyalty to the theatre, yes, and a deep need for control. But he lacked the imagination for such precise manipulation. The true architect of this murder is someone who understood the emotional weight of performance, the psychological stagecraft required to mislead not only an audience, but an investigator." I frowned. "You suspect someone else pulled the strings behind Dalrymple?" "Indeed, and they remain at large. Dalrymple acted as an editor, but someone else authored the script." We stood for a moment more in silence. Then Holmes turned abruptly. "We must return to Baker Street. There is something I must examine under clearer light." We arrived at our rooms shortly before midnight. Holmes wasted no time, lighting his lamp and retrieving the torn letter from his coat. He laid it carefully beside the theatre folio and produced his lens. I watched in silence as he inspected the edges of the envelope, then the handwriting inside the letter again. "There," he muttered. "Note the base line of the final stroke. See how it curves downward unnaturally? And the angle of pressure on the E. Someone tried to mimic a hand that was not their own. You think it was forged? Number Y think it was rewritten. Someone added to the original letter to obscure its meaning, the lower half of this page. These lines are inconsistent with the top. Trevelyan never received this letter in its final form. Someone intercepted it, altered it, and then returned it to his effects to mislead us. Who would do such a thing? Someone skilled in deception, someone who wanted the letter to implicate Lionel Asprey or Doris Bramble, someone who knew our investigation would turn on written motive. I considered this. But who would have had access? The dressing rooms were locked. The letter was hidden. "Hidden," Holmes echoed, "in a costume drawer, a place accessible to all cast members." He reached for the script once more, flipping quickly to Act 3. Note this line in the final confrontation. "It is not the blade that condemns, but the silence that precedes it." That is Trevelyan's voice. But here, 2 lines later, "Your curtain falls not for what you did, but what you failed to undo." That's a different rhythm, a different voice. Holmes tapped the page. Someone else contributed lines to this script. Someone whose guilt made them desperate to shape how the play would be interpreted if it were ever performed. "Miss Fenwick?" I asked slowly. "She's the only one who speaks with that cadence, and she was the only one who quoted Trevelyan directly, before anyone had seen the altered script. She knew what he planned to say, because she helped him write it." I stared at Holmes, the implications catching up to his words. "You think she was involved in Eleanor's downfall?" "I think she was more than involved. I think she engineered it." Holmes rose, already gathering his coat again. "Trevelyan's death was not a spontaneous act of silencing," he said. "It was the closing of a circle. He had given her the part of a lifetime, and she made sure he'd never deliver the final line. We arrived at Miss Fenwick's flat in Bloomsbury just past 1 o'clock. She answered the door still dressed, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Holmes," she said calmly, "you've come for the last scene, haven't you?" He stepped inside without invitation. The last scene has already been written, but not yet performed. She closed the door behind us with deliberate ease. "You've figured it out, then. I've understood that you played two roles, Miss Fenwick. The grieving colleague and the silent conspirator. You and Trevelyan were collaborators until he decided to reveal more than you agreed." She crossed to the fireplace, her hand resting on the mantel. "He wanted to be a martyr," she said coldly. "He wanted his guilt to consume all of us, to bleed out onto the stage like some final act of penance. But I wasn't willing to be sacrificed for his salvation." "He destroyed Eleanor," Holmes said. "We destroyed her," she replied. "But he enjoyed it. I didn't. That was the difference." "And Dalrymple?" "A coward. He carried it out, but he needed a push. I gave him one. The script was a noose. I only had to let him tighten it." Holmes did not reply immediately. He looked at her as though through a pane of glass. "You could have left," he said at last. "The past would have remained buried." "But the stage never forgets," she whispered. "Not truly. And Trevelyan was going to make me play the villain. I had to choose, silence or survival." Outside, the wind had picked up and a window pane rattled faintly. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, you'll find a constable 2 streets over. Kindly bring him. Miss Fenwick will remain here." She did not resist as I left. When I returned with the officer, she was seated calmly at her writing desk, quill poised, already composing what I presumed was her final monologue. As we departed, Holmes walked with his head lowered, the fog wreathing his coat. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he said after a long pause, "how the truth, when buried too long, does not fade, but festers, and when it emerges, it is not justice that follows, but theatre." And in that single phrase, I realized what had made this case unlike any other. The murderer had not only concealed her guilt, but written it into the script for us to find, knowing full well we would. A final bow, perfectly timed. Curtain down. It was well past 2 in the morning when we returned to Baker Street, the lamplight in our sitting room casting a quiet golden hue across Holmes's gaunt features. He had not spoken since we left Miss Fenwick's flat, and even as I prepared a pot of tea to stave off the fatigue beginning to press against my temples, he remained seated, motionless, with one leg crossed over the other and his fingers templed beneath his chin in that familiar pose of still concentration. The case, it seemed, was over. A murderer unmasked, a motive understood, and the final curtain drawn on a performance that had blurred the lines between artifice and actuality. Yet something in Holmes's silence troubled me more than any lingering ambiguity. "You're not satisfied," I said at last, placing the steaming cup beside him. His eyes flicked to it, then to me. "No," he replied simply. "Miss Fenwick confessed. She manipulated Dalrymple. You saw the changes in the script, the forged letter, the motive." "Yes," he said. "And yet." He stood suddenly and moved to the window, drawing back the curtain just enough to peer into the empty street below. The fog had lifted slightly, though the damp still clung to the panes. For a long moment he said nothing. "Watson," he murmured, "have you ever noticed how an actor's performance changes not when they are improvising, but when they have rehearsed the lie too many times?" I blinked. "I don't follow." Fenwick's confession was too polished. It was not the raw relief of a soul unburdened. It was curated, as though she were playing a final role, and she knew we would come. She had the speech ready, like a closing soliloquy. But the evidence, the evidence. He turned back, eyes sharp now. Therein lies the conundrum. The script was altered, the letter rewritten, but we assumed that Trevelyan's guilt over Eleanor was real. that he intended to confess and was silenced for it. What if the inverse is true? What if someone wanted it to appear that he was preparing to confess, so they could justify his murder? I sat down heavily. You mean he wasn't guilty? Holmes returned to the chair, his tone low and clipped. What if Eleanor's story was twisted? What if Trevelyan was preparing to expose someone else, not himself? Someone who had spread false rumors, manipulated the narrative, and now feared exposure. If so, everything we've uncovered was not evidence of guilt, but camouflage for the truth. But then why would Fenwick confess? To protect someone, or something. Holmes tapped the table lightly. Consider, Trevelyan changes the final scene. He casts the victim as orchestrator of the illusion, not the villain. But if the scene had proceeded as written, it would have exposed the real manipulator behind Eleanor's fall. That person could not allow the play to be staged. So they removed Trevelyan and replaced the truth with theater. I felt the familiar thrill of dread that came with Holmes' deeper turns of thought. You think Miss Fenwick was covering for someone even now? She was not the architect, Watson. She was a player. Her guilt is real, but not for the murder. She believes herself responsible for Eleanor, yes, and she used that guilt as a shield. She convinced herself that protecting the secret was noble. But the murder itself? I no longer believe she delivered the fatal blow. I stood. Then we must re-examine the evidence. Holmes had already turned to the script again, laying it beside the envelope. Look at the ink on the final revision. Not just the words, but the pressure, the texture. Someone added that passage with a different nib, a finer hand. Trevelyan's writing was firm, assertive, but this is tentative, uncertain, possibly feminine. You mean someone forged Trevelyan's rewrite as well? Exactly. The third act was altered after his death to make it appear he had planned a theatrical confession, but there's no certainty that he did. In fact, all indications now point to the opposite. He flipped the page. And this line, your curtain falls not for what you did, but what you failed to undo. This is not Trevelyan's language, it's someone else's voice. Someone with poetic leanings, yes, but too obsessed with moral balance. Not confession, retribution. I caught the implication at once. Asprey. Holmes nodded slowly. He's the only one with motive left. Eleanor was his sister. The room went still. Of course, I whispered. It was never about the theater. It was about vengeance. Holmes spoke quickly now, his deductions firing in clean, swift succession. He stayed close to Trevelyan, not out of camaraderie, but surveillance. He used Fenwick's guilt to craft a narrative. He tampered with the letter, then stole it back and planted it. He coached Dalrymple, whose loyalty to the company made him pliable. And when Trevelyan prepared to announce the truth, that Eleanor had not been harmed by him at all, but by whispers spread by another, Asprey struck. And Fenwick's confession. Planted. She was manipulated, made to believe Trevelyan was the villain. She confessed to save Asprey. Perhaps she even loved him, but he used her remorse as a stage. We stared at one another across the low table, the gas lamp crackling softly. Holmes stood again. There is one way to be sure. The theater opens again in 4 hours. We shall return, quietly. I expect Asprey will be there. He cannot resist rehearsing the final act. At 6:30, the Imperial was still shuttered, the sky outside lightening into a cold grey. Holmes and I entered through the rear, past the alley door used by crew. Inside, the stage lay in gloom, lit only by early shafts of dawn. A figure stood alone downstage, facing the empty rows. Asprey. He was speaking softly, rehearsing. I stood in silence, yes, but silence is not innocence, and I watched her fall, watched them all fall, and did nothing. Holmes stepped into the light. Well said, Mr. Asprey, but the audience is not yet seated. Asprey turned, startled, but not afraid. You're persistent, Holmes. And you, Holmes replied coolly. are the final playwright. Eleanor was your sister. Asprey's expression hardened. She trusted them, all of them, and when she broke, when she vanished, they stepped around the ruin as though it was scenery. You believed Trevelyan responsible, Holmes said, but he wasn't. He was trying to reveal the truth, that it was you who planted the story in the first place, out of jealousy. She had rejected your help. She succeeded without you. A tremor passed over Asprey's face. You rewrote the script, coerced Dalrymple, framed Fenwick, all to cleanse the past with a stage-crafted justice. I gave them what they deserved. Holmes' voice was low. Number you gave them what you needed, a role to play in your personal tragedy, but real justice does not take its bow. Asprey said nothing as the theatre doors opened behind us, and Inspector Gregson entered, his men moving swiftly to take the actor into custody. As the sun crept higher and the theatre filled with the rustle of uniforms and the slow dismantling of illusion, I turned to Holmes. You were right, I said. It wasn't a murder of rage. It was a script, a perfectly rehearsed lie. Holmes did not smile. The stage, Watson, is only ever honest when the play ends. And then, at last, the curtain fell. There is an odd hush that follows the unraveling of a great deception, as if even the air must catch its breath. Such was the mood within the Imperial Theatre in the hours after Asprey's arrest. The dawn light, now free from fog, poured through the upper windows and touched the red velvet of the seats, gilding the dust that hung in the air. Holmes stood at the edge of the orchestra pit, surveying the aftermath, not as a conqueror, but as a surgeon regarding the theatre of an operation, aware that the wound had been opened, the disease excised, but the scars would linger. Inspector Gregson and his men moved methodically, gathering evidence, securing the letters, scripts, and costume pieces that had been props in a drama whose tragedy had spilled off the stage and into life itself. I watched as Miss Fenwick, her face a pale mask, was gently led away by a uniformed officer, not as a suspect, but as a witness and, in some measure, a victim. Doris Bramble lingered near the wings, her eyes hollow. Dalrymple, silent, stared at nothing, his directorial power broken. Holmes, for his part, had taken up Trevelyan's original script. He turned the pages with an unusual gentleness, as if the manuscript were a wounded creature. I joined him in the circle of light near the orchestra pit. It is a peculiar thing, Watson, he said quietly, how the most elaborate schemes depend for their success, not on brilliance, but on the frailties of human emotion. Guilt, shame, longing. Each played their part precisely as Asprey anticipated. Miss Fenwick's guilt, Dalrymple's fear, even Doris's silence. Each was given a role and performed it to the letter. He paused, his gaze distant. Asprey's was a crime of obsession, not madness. He believed the theatre demanded a reckoning, but justice is not achieved by script or by applause. It is a slow, relentless pursuit, inevitable, though seldom theatrical. I saw then the fatigue in Holmes's face, and I wondered how many such cases would leave their imprint, not just on the world, but on the man himself. He closed the folio and handed it to Gregson, who nodded gravely. I shall see this is kept in evidence, Mr. Holmes, Gregson said. There'll be an inquest, of course, and much to untangle. Your report will be, well, essential. Holmes inclined his head. If the truth has not already exhausted your patience, Gregson, you'll find it all in Watson's notes. He has, as ever, been my diligent Boswell. I flushed a little at the praise, but Gregson managed a thin smile. With all due respect to Dr. Watson, it's your deductions the court will want, not his prose. Sometimes the story tells the truth better than the facts, Holmes replied, and with that, he withdrew from the crowd, gesturing for me to follow. We left the theatre behind, walking the quiet morning streets with the slow, tired gait of men who have seen too much of human frailty in too short a time. Holmes was silent, his thoughts elsewhere, until we reached the corner of Baker Street. There, beneath the sign, He stopped and drew a deep breath, almost as if casting off a burden. "There is something to be learned in every performance, Watson," he said at last. "From Trevelyan's tragedy, we learn that secrets, when kept too long, become a poison, one that does not just destroy the secret keeper, but everyone drawn into the web. From Asprey, that revenge may masquerade as justice, but its goal is always ruin." "And from you?" I asked. He smiled, the faintest ghost of amusement. "That even a detective must know when the play is done and the house lights are up." At Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson awaited us, her customary fussing subdued by the lateness of the hour and the weary cast of our faces. She brought us a simple breakfast, and I, for my part, sat at my desk, determined to commit the affair to paper while its details remained sharp in my mind. Holmes, meanwhile, retreated to his armchair with the morning papers, making no mention of the case. Yet I saw how he read. Not the headlines, but the spaces between, the society pages, the theatre reviews, searching perhaps for the smallest ripples left by the stone we had cast into the pond. In the days that followed, the case of Richard Trevelyan's death faded from public view as all such scandals do, swallowed by the city's insatiable appetite for fresh sensation. The Imperial Theatre's doors reopened. Its next play met with both curiosity and a certain haunted hush. I read the reviews with a peculiar fascination, noticing how not a single critic mentioned the events that had nearly destroyed the company. The performance, they said, was sober, remarkably restrained, and lacking the feverish energy of past productions. I wondered if any audience could truly be unaware of the ghost that now haunted the boards. Holmes accepted no accolades for his work. Indeed, he refused all interviews, citing the privacy of the living and the dignity of the dead. But I saw in his manner a greater quietness, a touch more gentleness with his violin, a deeper patience for Mrs. Hudson's stories. Perhaps it was the nature of this case, a play in which every participant, even the detective, had been required to question the role they played. One evening, as the fog rolled back in and the lamplighter made his solitary way down Baker Street, I found Holmes at the window, lost in thought. "You know, Watson," he said, "the theatre will never quite lose its allure for me. There, as here, men and women step upon the stage in search of meaning, redemption, or applause. They wear masks, speak lines, and sometimes believe themselves the author of their own fates. But in the end, it is always the truth, unscripted, unruly, and unforgiving, that writes the final scene." He let the curtain fall and, with a wry smile, reached for his violin. And so the music began anew, gentle and questioning, rising through the rooms of Baker Street as the city outside slumbered, and another case slipped quietly into the past. The slow return to our daily rhythm in Baker Street was marked by a peculiar, lingering quiet, as if some echo from the Imperial Theatre still haunted our rooms. The case of Richard Trevelyan had not only tested Holmes's deductive faculties, but had left a kind of weariness upon his spirit, a residue I had witnessed only after his most harrowing encounters with the darker corners of human nature. In those first days after the denouement, Holmes busied himself with monographs, chemical experiments, and a stubborn silence I dared not break except for practical necessities. He took his meals without comment and spent long hours bent over the violin, drawing from it the most introspective melodies, slow, minor airs that seemed to search for something just beyond their reach. I recognized in this music a form of healing, or perhaps of resignation. For my part, I devoted myself to writing up the particulars of the case, ensuring that every detail was faithfully recorded. There were moments when the threads seemed so knotted, so layered with misdirection and pain, that I doubted I could ever make them plain to a reader. Yet as I described each scene, the anxious arrivals at Baker Street, the haunted corridors of the theatre, the shifting alliances and final revelations, I began to perceive, with fresh clarity, the cost exacted by secrets long kept. It was during one of these late evenings that Holmes finally broke his silence. I was reviewing my notes by the lamp's soft glow when he glanced up from his chemical apparatus and spoke, his tone thoughtful, almost tentative. "You have been thorough, Watson, but do you believe you have found the truth?" I looked up, caught off guard by the directness of his gaze. "I have recounted the events as I saw them, Holmes. The truth, well, perhaps only the dead know it entirely." He smiled faintly. "Spoken like a man who has seen the faces behind the masks. Do you think the public will remember Trevelyan as a villain or a victim?" "I doubt they will remember him at all," I replied, with more sadness than I intended. "The world moves quickly from scandal to scandal. In a week, another tragedy will command the headlines." Holmes set down his glass beaker and regarded me across the table. "That is why your accounts matter, Watson. Not merely for the particulars of the puzzle, but for the people at its heart. You capture not just what happened, but what it felt like, for all involved." His words struck a chord. I had so often considered myself merely an observer, a recorder of Holmes's genius. But it was true. These stories preserved not only the facts but also the human cost, the wounded pride, the haunted consciences, the consequences that rippled outward long after the case was closed. That evening, as I finished the last page of my narrative, Holmes spoke again, more to himself than to me. Asprey's vengeance was more than retribution. It was a longing to make sense of chaos. But one cannot impose order on tragedy by merely apportioning blame. The world is too complex for that. What passes for justice in the theater, neat, swift, final, is but a pale imitation of the real thing. Outside, the rain had begun, tapping gently at the panes. Holmes rose and moved to the window, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. "You know, Watson, it is an irony that we are lauded as bringers of clarity, when so often what we bring is merely closure. The world remains shadowed, no matter how many lamps we light." I said nothing, recognizing that Holmes did not seek comfort, only understanding. His restlessness was a mark of his compassion, a burden few perceived in the man renowned for his intellect and detachment. It was with some relief, therefore, that we soon found ourselves called away from the gloom of the imperial affair. A telegram arrived the following morning from Inspector Lestrade announcing a matter requiring your immediate attention and particular insight. And though Holmes merely nodded, I saw the familiar spark return to his eyes. The city, inexhaustible in its appetite for mystery, had already produced another challenge, and Holmes, though wounded by the theater's ghost, could not long resist the summons of a fresh puzzle. We left Baker Street in the rain, passing through the familiar streets now glistening with reflected light. The last traces of the Imperial Theatre case receded behind us, though I was acutely aware that its lessons would remain. As our cab rattled through the morning traffic, Holmes sat quietly, fingers drumming in a syncopated rhythm, mind already distant. But before the city swallowed us whole once more, he glanced over at me and spoke in a low, almost confiding voice. "We must never forget, Watson, that behind every crime, however artfully staged, there is pain. Not just in the act, but in the memory. We are not merely untanglers of puzzles, but witnesses to the cost." It was a sentiment I carried with me as we embarked upon our new investigation, a reminder that every case, however neatly solved, left behind its share of shadows. And thus, as the city unfolded before us, teeming with untold dramas and hidden tragedies, I realized anew how closely our work resembled the theater. The world a stage, the actors unaware of the script, and Holmes, the most brilliant of them all, forever searching for the truth that waited behind the curtain. The story of the actor who played his own killer was done, but the performance of life in London continued, ever restless, ever unresolved. As the cab rolled through the rain-dappled morning streets, a faint silver glow beginning to lighten the clouds above, I found my thoughts returning with odd insistence to the Imperial Theatre. The business with Trevelyan had left a deeper impression on me than I first realized. It was not only the intricacy of the crime or the sorrows of those involved, but the peculiar way that truth, once revealed, seemed to shed not clarity but further shadows. Holmes, too, was uncommonly withdrawn as we journeyed toward our new destination, fingers steepled, gaze fixed not on the passing scenery, but upon the complicated map of his own thoughts. The city itself seemed to have shed the mood of the theatre's tragedy with a brisk indifference. Already the newsboys were shouting fresh headlines. Carriages splashed through puddles and the shops prepared to open. Yet, to those of us who had seen the ghost behind the curtain, London now wore a subtly altered face, a little less innocent, a little more aware of the darkness beneath the gas-lit veneer. Holmes did not speak until we had nearly reached Scotland Yard. Then, as if a switch had been thrown within him, he straightened, and the old keenness returned to his voice. "Lestrade's telegram was unusually terse, Watson. I suspect he faces something that threatens to slip beyond his grasp." I nodded, glad to find Holmes' interest revived. He mentioned a matter of urgency. Some theft, perhaps. Holmes shook his head. He would not summon me for a theft alone unless there were a complication, a pattern, a message, or a corpse. Likely, we are about to be presented with a case as tangled as any we have yet encountered. I confess, after the melancholy of the theatre, I welcome the distraction. When we entered Lestrade's office, we found the inspector pacing the worn carpet, a stack of folders in one hand, and a familiar look of harried irritation upon his face. He greeted Holmes with a perfunctory handshake and gestured for us to sit. "Glad you came, Holmes, Doctor. This isn't a run-of-the-mill business. We've a dead man, found in a boarding house off Russell Square, and, well, it's easier if you see for yourself." He handed Holmes a slim packet of notes and several photographs. The victim, a middle-aged man of unremarkable appearance, had been discovered slumped at a writing desk, his hand still clutching a fountain pen. The police surgeon's report indicated death by a sudden and violent administration of poison, prussic acid by all accounts, with little sign of struggle or violence. Holmes studied the images and the account in silence, his eyes moving quickly from detail to detail. At length he said, "The presence of the pen suggests the victim was engaged in writing at the time of death. Was a letter found?" Lestrade nodded, retrieving a sealed envelope from his desk. "Here, addressed to a Miss Cora Lind. The contents are cryptic. See for yourself." Holmes slit the envelope, drew out a single sheet, and read aloud. "Dearest Cora, the past is not so easily left behind as we pretend. There are debts that remain unpaid, and some roles that must be played to their end. Forgive me what I could not confess. The stage is set, the audience is waiting. Yours always, J." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the patter of rain against the window. Holmes handed the letter to me. "You see, Watson, how the theatre follows us. Our new victim was an actor in life, or at least in spirit." Lestrade grunted. I thought the same. His name was Julian Gresham. Clerk by trade, nothing remarkable in his lodgings, except, perhaps, a shelf of Shakespeare and a ticket stub to the Imperial Theatre, dated last Thursday. A chill went through me at the mention. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Another player in the company?" "Not as far as I can tell," Lestrade said. "But the timing, his death coming so soon after the Trevelyan affair, it's a coincidence I can't ignore. And there's one more thing. The landlady said he had a visitor the night before. A man with a stage actor's bearing, she said. Tall, well-spoken, wore a heavy scarf and gloves. Could have been anyone. But it matches the description of Lionel Asprey, whom you just helped us put away." Holmes's expression became grave. "That is impossible. Asprey has been in custody since dawn." "Nevertheless, the landlady insists. And, as you know, the theatre is a place of mirrors. Anyone could assume such a costume, if they wished to deceive. I considered the implications. Do you suppose, Holmes, that someone is continuing the drama begun at the Imperial? Or is this the aftermath, a settling of old scores among those still left behind? Holmes did not answer at once. He turned the letter over, examining it beneath his glass. Then, with a small exclamation, he beckoned us closer. Note the watermark, Watson. Imperial Mill, 1888. Unremarkable at first, but look here. An imprint in the lower left, as if another letter had been placed atop it while the ink was wet. The faintest trace of a second name. Fenwick. My heart raced. Miss Fenwick, then? Or someone wishing us to believe it so? The method is too artful, too redolent of stagecraft. We are not yet free of the theatre's web, Watson. If anything, the second act has begun. He folded the letter carefully, handing it back to Lestrade. I will need to see the boarding house at once, and the possessions of the deceased. There is a pattern here, one that echoes the artifice we have just witnessed. As we left Scotland Yard and hailed a cab, Holmes leaned toward me, his eyes bright despite the exhaustion that still haunted his features. Remember, Watson, in the world of the theatre, even the end of the play is only the beginning of another. What we thought finished was merely the closing of one act. The drama resumes, and the curtain has not yet fallen. The carriage rattled through the streets toward Russell Square, and the city, for all its bustle, seemed suddenly still, waiting, perhaps, for the next line to be spoken, the next secret to be revealed. And I, for all my weariness, felt the old thrill of anticipation. For I knew that with Holmes beside me, whatever shadows awaited, we would follow the story wherever it led, until the true author was revealed, and the play at last was done. The ride to Russell Square was a short one, yet the weight of fresh mystery pressed upon us as though the cab were crawling through fog. Holmes was silent, hands pressed together at his mouth, eyes fixed not on the rain-smeared windows, but upon the intricate lattice of possibility forming in his mind. For my own part, I could not shake the sense of déjà vu. The language of the dead man's letter, the allusion to debts and rolls, the imprinted name Fenwick. It was as if the ghost of the Imperial Theatre had refused to be exorcised, instead pursuing us from the footlights into the very heart of London's daily existence. We arrived at the boarding house, a dingy 3-story in a terrace of similar buildings, and were admitted by a landlady who had clearly told her story a dozen times already and grown no less anxious in the telling. Holmes listened to her polite but distracted questions, eyes taking in every detail of the faded wallpaper and battered carpet as she led us upstairs. Julian Gresham's room was at the end of a narrow corridor. The door stood open, guarded by a constable who let us pass with a respectful nod. Inside, the chamber was small and spare. A single bed, a wooden writing desk by the window, a battered trunk. The faintest odor of bitter almonds, prussic acid, still lingered in the stale air. I felt a shiver despite myself. Holmes went straight to the desk. There, beside the inkwell and the heavy fountain pen, lay a sheaf of notepaper, a battered volume of Hamlet, and a small framed photograph. He examined each item in turn, turning the photograph over in his hands and lifting it to the light. The image was of a young woman, strikingly pretty, with keen eyes and a melancholy smile. Written on the back, in a spidery hand, "To J, yours in memory and hope, Cora." Holmes passed it to me without a word and began examining the pages upon the desk. Most were covered in untidy lists, expenses, addresses, scraps of what looked like poetry or dramatic monologue. One, however, caught his attention. A sheet bearing a list of names, each crossed through except for 2 at the bottom, Fenwick and Doris. He gave a low whistle. "A ledger, Watson. A reckoning." I looked over his shoulder. "The same names as the company at the Imperial?" He nodded. All but Asprey, Trevelyan, and Dalrymple, each already dead or disgraced. Only Fenwick and Doris remain. My unease deepened. Do you believe Gresham was involved in the affair at the theatre? Holmes shook his head. Number more likely, he was an echo. A man who clung to the fringes of the company, or perhaps someone who shared an old grievance. His letter suggests a guilt unresolved, a part played in shadows. And yet his death was almost certainly not a suicide. The composition, the scent of almonds, the neatness of the desk, all are too carefully arranged, too theatrical. He turned to the battered trunk and knelt to examine the lock. Note the scratches here, Watson. Recent and made by someone in haste. The trunk has been searched. Did you notice, too, the faint smudge on the inside of the window pane? Someone leaned out, perhaps to pass a message or to dispose of something. Holmes rose and strode to the window, opening it and peering down into the alley below. After a moment he turned to the constable. May I trouble you for a moment's search in the alley, directly below this window? There may be a scrap of paper or some small object discarded in haste. The constable hurried off, and Holmes returned to the desk, this time inspecting the inkwell. He dipped a finger and brought it to his nose, grimacing. Prussic acid again, but the residue at the rim suggests the poison was introduced after the victim began to write. Someone tampered with the pen or inkwell, knowing Gresham's habits. The tread of boots on the stairs heralded the constable's return. He handed Holmes a crumpled slip of paper, damp and grimy from the alley floor. Holmes unfolded it with care. Scrawled upon it in hurried, trembling letters was a single sentence. They will never let the curtain fall. Beware the woman with two faces. He handed it to me. A warning or a confession. What do you make of it, Watson? I hesitated, then read the note again. It suggests a threat. Someone who played a double part. Fenwick? Or Doris Bramble, Holmes mused. Both have reason for guilt. Both have worn masks. One for the audience, one for the company. He pocketed the note and turned to the landlady. Did anyone visit Mr. Gresham yesterday? Anyone besides the gentleman you described to Inspector Lestrade? She nodded. There was a woman, sir. Came by in the afternoon. Very polite, well-dressed. Asked for Julian as if she were his sister. But when I called up, he refused to see her. She left a card, but there's nothing written on it. Holmes accepted the calling card and inspected it under his glass. There, barely visible in the lower corner, was an embossed initial, M. Margot Fenwick, he said quietly. Or someone passing as her. He turned to me, his eyes bright and purposeful. We are not yet finished, Watson. This case has been extended by an unseen hand. Gresham was drawn into the theatre's shadow and paid with his life. The ledger, the letter, the warning, they point to a final reckoning. As we descended the stairs and re-entered the rain, Holmes set his jaw with new resolve. The woman with two faces, whoever she is, knows we are close. She fears exposure. Our next step is clear. We must find both Miss Fenwick and Doris Bramble before another curtain falls. We hailed a cab and drove through the brightening drizzle toward Covent Garden, where the morning crowd was already gathering. Holmes remained silent, sifting possibilities with every turn of the wheel. The city, for all its bustle, seemed to hush and listen, a stage on which the last act of this strange tragedy was about to play out. As we drew near the theatre district, Holmes touched my arm and spoke in a low, urgent voice. Be ready, Watson. The real performance is about to begin, and this time there may be no encore. Holmes and I arrived at Covent Garden in the busy mid-morning, the rain tapering off, but the market still slick and shimmering under the weak sunlight. The district bustled with flower sellers, cabmen, and the scattered members of London's theatrical world, none of whom spared us more than a cursory glance as we pressed on toward the Imperial Theatre. As we neared the theatre's service entrance, Holmes paused to study the flow of foot traffic. "Doris Bramble will be here, Watson," he murmured. "She is too loyal to her work to hide, and this place remains her only home. As for Miss Fenwick, hers is the part most shrouded in ambiguity, the woman with two faces. We must be careful in our questioning." Inside, the Imperial felt oddly transformed. The familiar gloom had retreated. The lights were lit, and workers bustled about, painting sets and mending costumes for the upcoming production. Yet beneath this busy facade, an unease lingered, as if the theater's walls remembered more than the company cared to admit. Holmes wasted no time in seeking out Doris. We found her in the prop room, sleeves rolled, quietly sorting daggers and swords into their labeled boxes. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I didn't expect you." Holmes offered a nod. "Miss Bramble, we must speak with you at once. The death of Julian Gresham last night. Do you know anything of it?" Doris's eyes widened. "Julian, he's dead. Poisoned," Holmes replied, his gaze unyielding. "But before you answer, you must understand the gravity of the situation. The past is not as distant as you might wish." She seemed to sag a little, her strong hands trembling as she set down a sword. "I only saw him once since all that business with Trevelyan. He was troubled. He spoke of debts he could never pay. But I didn't kill him." Holmes's voice was gentle but firm. "Was he connected to Eleanor Blake, or to the affair that destroyed so many here?" Doris hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He was part of the company then. A walk-on, hardly noticed. But he knew. He saw how Eleanor was treated. I think it haunted him. He and Margot Fenwick. They used to be close once. Long before all this. But after Eleanor left, Margot changed. Became harder. She stopped trusting anyone." "Did he ever mention being threatened? Or speak of Margot in recent days?" "No, sir. Only that he was afraid. Of something coming due. He was writing letters, he said, and making a list." She glanced down, her hands wringing the hem of her apron. "He told me he was planning to leave London. Said the past wouldn't let him, though." Holmes pressed on. "And Miss Fenwick? Has she been here today?" Doris shook her head. "Not since the news of Gresham's death broke. She's staying at lodgings in Bloomsbury, I think, near the museum. If you want to find her, she'll be there." Holmes thanked her quietly. As we turned to go, Doris caught my sleeve, her voice low. "If you find her, Doctor, tell her not to be afraid. She's been punishing herself long enough." Outside, Holmes hailed a cab at once. "To Bloomsbury, quickly," he told the driver. The rain had nearly ceased, but a heavy tension pressed upon us both. We found Miss Fenwick's building without difficulty, a modest house on a tidy street, well removed from the bustle of the theatres. Holmes mounted the steps 2 at a time and rapped sharply. A matronly woman opened the door and, upon hearing our request, led us to a small drawing room where Margot Fenwick stood at the window, her silhouette limned by the pallid morning light. She turned at our entrance, and I was startled by how changed she appeared. The sharp confidence of her stage manner was gone. She looked wan, older, eyes dark-rimmed with sleeplessness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." Her voice was almost a whisper. Holmes bowed slightly. "Miss Fenwick, forgive the intrusion. We come not only to seek the truth about Gresham, but to prevent further tragedy. You must be honest now, for your own sake and for all those still living under the shadow of these events." She looked at him, searching his face for judgment, then seemed to surrender to her own exhaustion. "You have read Julian's letter?" "We have." She turned away, her hands trembling as she gripped the windowsill. "Julian was not strong. He tried to do the right thing, but he was always looking for someone to tell him what was right. When she vanished, he came to me, wanted to go to the police. I begged him to wait, to let the company handle it. But nothing was ever handled. I did nothing. That is my guilt. And now he is dead." Holmes's tone was gentler than I had expected. Who killed him, Miss Fenwick? Tears shone in her eyes, but she shook her head. I don't know. He was frightened, but he never said by whom. The last time I saw him, he told me he felt haunted by a woman with two faces. I thought perhaps he meant me. For I have been two women these last years, the actress and the coward. Holmes stepped closer. Miss Fenwick, we found a warning among Gresham's things. A message. They will never let the curtain fall. Beware the woman with two faces. Was it meant for you or someone else? Her hands fell to her sides. I can't say. Perhaps for Doris. She suffered as much as I. We all did. But if you think I killed Julian, you are wrong. I have run out of roles to play. I can barely live with the one I have. Holmes studied her, then nodded as if some hidden test had been passed. Thank you, Miss Fenwick. We shall trouble you no further. For now. Back in the street, Holmes walked for some time in silence, his steps purposeful but his brow furrowed. I waited for him to speak, recognizing the deep absorption that always signaled a breakthrough close at hand. Watson, he said at last, the answer is here, in plain sight. The tragedy is that all of them, Fenwick, Doris, Gresham, have tried in vain to atone for something beyond atonement. But there is another hand at work, moving among them unseen. The poison was no gesture of revenge, but of desperation, a silencing not of the guilty, but of the witness. He stopped abruptly, turning to me. We must return to the Imperial, and quickly. The final player has yet to make their entrance, and this time I intend to meet them face to face. As we hurried back through the crowded streets, the city's ceaseless din seemed to hush for a moment, the world poised at the edge of a revelation. I felt, more than ever, the nearness of the story's true climax, its final, devastating act. And beside me, Holmes strode forward, certain at last of the direction in which the truth lay, his mind fixed on the stage where the last lines awaited their delivery. The walk back to the Imperial Theatre was swift, the pace dictated by Holmes's mounting urgency. He spoke little, but I could see the tension in his movements, a readiness as if the final pieces of a grim tableau were sliding into place. The city, for all its clamor, seemed to recede behind us as we crossed into the realm of shadows and secrets that still clung to the old playhouse. When we entered by the stage door, the theatre was dim and mostly deserted, save for a lone lamp burning in the wings and the muffled sounds of someone working above us in the fly gallery. Holmes led the way down the labyrinth of backstage corridors, pausing just outside the manager's office. He signaled for silence and pressed his ear to the door. A woman's voice, low and strained, filtered through the wood. It's over now. They know everything. There's nothing left but to leave. There was a brief, desperate reply. A man's voice, familiar from rehearsals, but now raw with fear. Holmes drew back and, without hesitation, opened the door. Inside, Doris Bramble stood facing Frances Dalrymple, her face pale in the lamplight, her eyes rimmed with red. Dalrymple's shoulders sagged, as if some unbearable weight had settled upon him. An open valise lay on the desk, filled with scattered papers and a half-empty bottle of laudanum. Holmes entered quietly, and both looked up in startled silence. "You are right, Miss Bramble," Holmes said softly. "It is over, but it need not end in tragedy." Doris looked away, struggling to compose herself, while Dalrymple clutched the back of his chair, his knuckles white. Holmes closed the door behind us and took in the scene with a glance, then spoke with a gentle certainty that had soothed more than one frightened soul. "Miss Bramble, you have carried too much for too long, and you, Mr. Dalrymple, you have tried to hold the company together with secrets, not trust. But secrets, as we've seen, are poison. Literally so in Gresham's case." Dalrymple stared at Holmes, then at the bottle on the desk. I never meant for anyone to die." Holmes shook his head. "Not by your hand, perhaps. But someone used your guilt and Doris's loyalty as a shield for their own crime. He turned to Doris, his voice kind but unwavering. The warning to Gresham, the woman with two faces, was never meant for you, nor for Margot Fenwick. It was meant for Eleanor. Or rather, the memory of Eleanor, the part of her that lived on in all of you, split by grief and self-preservation. Doris covered her face with her hands. We should have helped her. We all saw. None of us did enough. Holmes nodded. Gresham's death was a silencing, not a reckoning. He was close to telling someone what he'd seen. The poison was administered not with vengeance, but with fear. Fear of exposure. Dalrymple's voice cracked. But who? Everyone is broken, Holmes. There's no one left to protect. Holmes moved to the window and drew back the curtain. The street below was empty, save for a single figure watching from across the way, her outline unmistakable. "Wait here," Holmes said, striding from the room. I followed, heart thudding as he hurried down the stairs and out into the street. The woman was already moving away, but Holmes, with long strides, quickly closed the distance. "Miss Fenwick," he called. She turned, pale and defiant. "Why have you come, Mr. Holmes? I told you all I know." "You have told me all you remember, perhaps," he said gently. "But the mind is a labyrinth, Miss Fenwick. Guilt can conceal truth even from ourselves. Julian Gresham was poisoned because he would not let the past rest. He came to you for absolution, and you gave him comfort, but not safety," she faltered. "I didn't kill him, I swear." Holmes shook his head. "You did not, but you know who did." He produced the slip of paper recovered from the alley, the hurried warning. "Who, in your company, was closest to Julian, trusted with his fears, privy to his remorse?" She swallowed, glancing away. "Doris. He confided in Doris, always." She pitied him. Holmes nodded. She pitied him, and feared what his confession might mean. But even she did not act alone. The poison came from the manager's office, the bottle of laudanum on Dalrymple's desk. Was it always there? "No," she whispered. "Francis kept it locked. He was terrified of its presence." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "And who had the keys?" For a long moment, Margot Fenwick did not answer. Then her shoulders sagged. "I did. For a time. After Trevelyan died, I was asked to keep the office in order. Doris must have found the key, or you gave it to her, unwittingly. The guilt spread among you all, each carrying a piece of the truth, but none seeing the whole." Holmes looked back at the theatre, then at Miss Fenwick. "It is over now. There will be no more deaths. You must tell the police what you know. The time for secrets has ended." She nodded, tears finally streaming down her face. "We were all cowards, Mr. Holmes. Even now, I cannot say who was the worst." As Holmes guided her back toward the theatre, the rain began again, soft, steady, as if to wash the last stains from the city stage. Inside, Doris and Dalrymple were waiting, weary and resigned. Holmes spoke with calm authority, coaxing the full truth from them at last. How Gresham, overcome by remorse, threatened to tell all. How Doris, unable to bear the prospect, had procured the poison, unwittingly abetted by Dalrymple, whose only crime was weakness. How the burden of Eleanor's memory had twisted each of them until, at last, it brought down the curtain on their little company. Lestrade arrived soon after, and Holmes explained all with the clarity and compassion only he could muster. The inspector, seasoned though he was, listened in silence, his face grim. The statements were taken. Doris, devastated but relieved, accepted her fate without protest. Dalrymple was left to contemplate his failures in solitude. Margot Fenwick, no longer the woman with two faces, but only herself, sat quietly as the truth, at last, settled among them all. Holmes and I departed as the police took charge, the theatre's doors closing behind us. In the hush of the rainy street, Holmes looked up at the faded marquee, then at me. A sad play, Watson, and the saddest part, perhaps, is that it never truly ended, only faded into memory. Let us hope that, for those left behind, there is peace in the closing act. And so we turned away from the Imperial Theatre, the case complete, the wounds left to heal as best they might. The curtain had fallen, not with applause, but with the soft, forgiving silence of rain upon empty streets. Holmes and I walked through the quiet, rain-soaked streets, our steps slow as the tension of the last days ebbed from our shoulders. The Imperial Theatre's silhouette faded behind us, lost in the tangle of London's lanes and the soft shroud of drizzle. For a time, neither of us spoke. The case had weighed heavily, and though the facts were now at rest, a shadow lingered, a sadness for all that had been lost to guilt, pride, and secrecy. At last, we reached Baker Street. Inside, the gaslights glowed with a gentle warmth. I took my place by the fire, the day's dampness still in my bones. Holmes stood at the window for several minutes, watching the carriages roll by. At length, he turned, a look of thoughtful melancholy in his eyes. "You see, Watson, how tragedy breeds tragedy, and how a single wound, left untreated, can poison the lives of many. Each player in this drama was compelled less by evil than by fear, of truth, of loneliness, of their own conscience. Gresham, Fenwick, Doris, Dalrymple, none found the courage to speak, and so silence became their undoing." He crossed the room and, with a deft hand, poured us both a measure of brandy. I accepted mine gratefully. "It was never a matter of deduction alone," Holmes continued. "In this affair, the clues were not only in ink or handwriting or the sequence of locked doors, but in the very hearts of those involved. It was guilt, shared and magnified, that shaped the course of events. Gresham died because he could not carry the past any longer. Doris poisoned him, believing she was protecting what little remained of the company's honor, but in truth, she only ensured the ruin she feared. Dalrymple's weakness was to let others steer his fate, and Miss Fenwick, she tried at the end to shed her mask and become herself, but for too long she had let others dictate her role." He paused, the firelight catching the lines of fatigue about his face. "There is a lesson here, Watson, though it is not one of comfort. Even the most brilliant performance cannot save an actor from the truth he carries off stage. A man may deceive an audience or even himself for a time, but not forever." I reflected on all that had passed, the warnings scrawled in haste, the fatal poison in a trusted bottle, the confessions made too late. Yet in the closing of this case, I could not help but feel, as Holmes did, the sting of all that had gone unsaid and undone. As if sensing my mood, Holmes offered a rare smile. "You see, my friend, the theatre is only a reflection of life. The stage is set, the players move, the curtain falls. But what matters is not the applause or the verdict, but whether those who remain can step from the shadows and walk into the light." He sat down with his violin and drew the bow softly across the strings, playing a tune at once sorrowful and serene. The melody wound through the lamplit room, echoing the story we had lived, a story not just of murder and deduction, but of regret and the hope for forgiveness. In the days that followed, word of the case faded into the background hum of the city. The Imperial Theatre reopened, its company smaller, chastened, but perhaps at last honest with themselves. Miss Fenwick was cleared of any charge. Doris, though held accountable, was granted leniency, for her crime was judged as much a consequence of despair as of malice. Dalrymple quietly left London, seeking some measure of peace elsewhere. Of Gresham little was said, save that he had been a man destroyed by memory and fear. Holmes, for his part, resumed his familiar habits. He turned once more to the quiet of his chemical experiments and the restless search for new puzzles. Yet I noted in his manner a fresh compassion, a patience with small things and small people, as if the drama at the Imperial had softened something within him. On the final evening of that long week, as we sat by the window watching the mist curl along Baker Street, Holmes spoke with that gentle, philosophical air I had come to cherish. "We are not, in the end, arbiters of fate, Watson. We only seek to shed a little light upon the darkness, so that others may find their way. For some, the theatre of life is brief and tragic. For others, there is a chance, at last, for a true and honest encore." He raised his glass. I raised mine. And in that quiet moment, simple, sincere, I understood what Holmes had always known, that even the most tangled mystery, once brought to light, is not the end, but a beginning. The case of the actor who played his own killer was done. The curtain had fallen, but the world beyond the stage beckoned with its infinite possibilities, waiting for those with courage enough to step forward and live their true part. And with that, our rooms fell silent, save for the music of the city, a low, eternal overture, drifting in through the rain-washed glass, while Holmes, my friend, sat quietly in the firelight. The greatest detective of them all, at peace with another story told.